I'm calling in from Singapore. Is anyone else calling in from Asia? Great, great. I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the YLT SIG coordinator, David Valenti, and the rest of the SIG committee members. We are so pleased to be involved. Before I introduce the two speakers, I'd like to take this opportunity to update you, our members, followers, and friends on the YLT SIG upcoming events throughout 2018. So we're kicking off 2018 by supporting the third annual just having a little bit of an issue with my slide. Sean, would you mind clicking it so that the next event comes up? Thank you. Great. We're kicking off 2018 by supporting the third annual British Council Chile Young Learners Conference in Santiago. The theme is teaching young learners methods, materials, and conditions on 5th and 6th January. Please check our website and social media in December for details of the plenary speakers and the full program. And the next event, I click here. All right, oops. Okay. We're thrilled to share the theme of our 2018 YLT SIG Web Conference, Around the YLT World in 24 Hours. It's a nonstop 24-hour web conference on 10 February, and it will feature YLT practitioners from around the globe, including Africa, Asia, Australia, the Americas, and Europe. It's a free online event, and it's set to put the I in IATEFL. It shouldn't be missed. Keep your eye on our website and social media channels for more details. The third event that I'd like to talk about is the first time ever YLT SIG is hosting a pre-conference event at the Regional Africa TESOL Conference in Dakar, Senegal. On 4th May, we're extremely grateful to the ELT consultants, our key delivery partners for this day-long event, and we'll be focusing on secondary ELT in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. So we're really excited about that. YLT SIG will also be participating with the BRAS TESOL YL SIG to craft a bespoke training program delivered during the BRAS TESOL conference between 19 to 22 July. This teacher development course will be aimed at experienced YL ELT practitioners and accredited by the University from Caxias do Sul, Brazil. Please check the BRAS TESOL and YLT SIG details for websites for details next year. In October, the SIG will be collaborating with the ELT Council in Malta to host a day dedicated to YL ELT, and the theme will be announced on the ELT Council and SIG website as well as social media nearer to the time. As you can see, we really are linking, developing, and supporting YL ELT professionals worldwide. So the next slide, great. The highlight of the SIG events calendar is our annual pre-conference event, which will be on Monday, 9th April at the Brighton Centre, UK. Our 2018 theme is children's rights, children's future, practical applications in TEYL, and focuses on applying the United Nations Rights of the Child and Sustainable Development Goals to YL ELT. Anna Maria Pinter and Harry Kutcher are our plenary speakers and will unpack the what, why, and how of children's rights and the SDGs. We will build on the plenaries using TED Talks, by speakers representing early years, primary, and secondary ELT. All right. The day will culminate with a debate around a pedagogy challenging motion led by a specialist panel. Join us in Brighton to discover how rights-based pedagogies and incorporating the SDGs can transform your work with children and teenagers. So now I'm very honored to introduce Carol Reed. The YLT SIG speakers at today's web conference will focus on the crucial area of values education in YLELT. And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Carol Reed. Carol has over 30 years experience in ELT as a teacher, teacher trainer, academic manager, materials writer, and educational consultant. Carol's main specialization is in primary teaching, and she has published extensively in this area, including the award-winning titles 500 Activities in the Primary Classroom, Bugs, and Tiger Time. Carol was president and vice president of IATEFL from 2012 to 2016. You can find out more about Carol by visiting her website, www.carolreed.com. Over to you, Carol. Thank you. I think Carol's coming.
Carol's coming. Carol's coming. Carol's here. Can you hear me, everybody?
We can. Good.
Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? Okay, brilliant. Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to see so many of you here on Saturday morning, afternoon, or in your pajamas, whatever you are. And we're going to be looking in the next 40 minutes or so at values education for children, issues, challenges, and solutions. And I would like to start off by briefly talking about UK's most famous refugee, at least in children's literature, that is, created by Michael Bond in 1956. And when Paddington Bear turned up from deepest, darkest Peru with only a jar of marmalade to recommend him, he was welcomed in to the Browns family house in Notting Hill Gate and looked after. And Michael Bond often said that his creation was based on his memory of children evacuees in the Second World War. And I think the million-dollar question is, if Paddington Bear pitched up today, would he get the same welcome? And this was a question asked by an article in a newspaper some time ago at the time of the Calais refugee camp being closed. And of course, actually child refugees did not get the same welcome. But all is not lost, and there are positive signs. And actually, most recently, Paddington Bear has been recruited to teach children about refugees and migration by a UK magazine called The Big Issue, and also several UK primary schools who've been using Paddington Bear to teach children about these issues. And of course, I think as we would all recognise, education and values are inextricably linked. And I've put a few quotations on the screen there for you to, I'll leave you to read them. But you might like to see, the connection between education and nurturing, and heart and soul, values at the heart and soul of education. And that values education goes to the heart of the role of the teacher and effective learning. And the last quotation there, that it is a pedagogical imperative for student well-being. Well-being, if you like, a state of health and happiness. But as we all know also these days, children's well-being is actually being threatened by germ. And as many of you will know, this is based on the work of the Finnish educator Pasi Sahlberg. GERM, which stands for the Global Education Reform Movement, and which he sees as a virus spreading globally through the educational world. And that GERM is characterized by things like increased standardization in education, by a narrowing of the curriculum and a narrow focus on literacy and numeracy, by a low-risk approach to teaching, and very often in many contexts, a kind of scripted pedagogy, and an increased focus on test-based accountability, corporate management models for schools, and generally speaking, an overemphasis on big data as opposed to small data interactions, all those important things that go on between teachers and students in their relationships and everyday interactions in classrooms, as talked about by people like Earl Stevick and Van Leer. And I think, not to leave another bear out of my talk, I think actually the contrast between big data and narrowing of the curriculum and small data, holistic learning, and those important things in our teaching is characterized by this little exchange between Pooh and Piglet, where Piglet asks, "How do you spell love?" And Pooh says, "You don't spell it, you feel it." And actually, we are in danger in our education system of losing sight of that feelings and values side of things and just becoming obsessed with spelling and accuracy and measuring the things that we can measure. And of course, there are a number of ways of countering germ in our classes. And these are through things like engagement, through creativity. Do put things in the chat box, by the way, if you have any things to add to what I'm saying here. Through engagement, through creativity, through the quality of our relationships with children, through small data, all those little interactions which we can't necessarily measure, but which are so important, with learner autonomy, developing children's autonomy and offering choice in the curriculum. And finally, of course, the subject of our webinar this morning, putting values education at the heart of education where it belongs. So the big question to you now, and I don't want you to think of a definition, but to put ideas in the chat box. So what are values? What is it we're talking about? Can we see some things here? Just any ideas, words, phrases that occur to you? What are values? Anyone? Multiple attendees are typing. Brilliant, fantastic, lovely. Yes, okay, respecting decency, fantastic, lots of lovely ideas there. And actually in the literature on values, which is a very complex area, there are many different kinds of definitions. Some of them focus, for example, on the idea of values as a disposition to act in a certain way given the opportunities. So not necessarily the way you will act, but this disposition. Other definitions focus on the quality and traits of people, characteristics of people that make you a better person. Things such as honesty and courage, and some of these lovely ideas that you've been putting in the chat books here. Other definitions talk about values as kind of ethical DNA, the kind of DNA that makes us act in certain ways without even realizing it. And of course, other aspects of values that get focused on in the literature are to do with the priorities that individuals and societies attach to different beliefs, experience, things that they treasure, if you like. That is something that is referred to in the literature. However, since we're talking about children in this webinar, I want to share with you a definition of values, one that has actually been used with children, that is designed for children to understand, and it is from Neil Hawkes and his work on a whole school's values-based education policy, which he's written about extensively, not only in 2013, but actually since the beginning of this century. And of course, looking at values, there are different dimensions of values, 3 principal dimensions of values that we need to take into account in our work with children. And the first of those is the cognitive dimension. Actually, the thinking, the knowing, the understanding reasons given in justification of those beliefs which supply the motivation for adopting different values. And of course, other dimensions include, importantly, the affective dimension, the will, the volitional dimension, as it's sometimes called, the feeling deeply, the actually believing in values and wanting to act in a certain way. And the third dimension, of course, which is of course absolutely crucial in our day-to-day, is the behavioural dimension. Actually, how the values we have influence the way that we behave and act in the world. And as you can see by the Venn diagram that I've chosen there, these areas, they all overlap and influence each other. And of course, values refer to different spheres in our lives. And put very simply, we can see that there are three spheres: values in relation to ourselves, values in relation to others, and values in relation to the world around us. So in relation to ourselves, for example, values such as honesty, reliability, perseverance. In relation to others, respect, tolerance, kindness. And in relation to the world around us or the environment, maybe things to do with recycling, using water sensibly, being aware of issues such as poverty in the world and what we can do around it. And actually, I can see you've put already loads of values in the box, but would you just like now to add some more values that you can think of in relation to any of these areas? And if you like, just type the colour so we know which area you're talking about. If you'd like to just any values that occur to you off the top of your head. Let me see those coming in. Resilience, absolutely fantastic. Yes, tolerance, lovely, lovely. Yes, red. And of course, there is overlap here between these areas. Respect, empathy, fantastic. Yes, lovely. And of course, actually, when we think of these spheres of values, I think it's important to make the point that there is a difference between the personal sphere, the private sphere, if you like, our own personal morality, and also the social and public sphere, the kind of community values. And we need to merge both. And actually, community values are dependent, are reliant on people's personal vision and beliefs. And the other thing I think that's important just to mention is that values are frequently associated with moral values, but I think we also have to be aware that they do apply to other spheres as well, such as intellectual, aesthetic, technical, religious, social. So actually, although we're language educators and talking about language teaching, values education actually applies to every area of the curriculum. So if those are values rather rapidly looked at, what are we talking about when we talk about values education? And actually here, what I want to do is share with you a definition that I've come up with values education for children. I'm not going to read that out to you there, but I'm using this definition as this is really what we're talking about in this session. And actually, as Lovett and Toomey say, writers on values education, that they talk about values education being at the heart of quality teaching and positive relationships in schools. So that all sounds very well, but actually values education is a little bit of a Pandora's box, as I'm sure already a lot of you are thinking. It's a very complex area. It's also a very controversial area. And I'm not aiming to solve any of the controversies now, but I do want to unpack them, if you like, and get us to think about them, because I think it's really important for us to be aware of them in our teaching. And the first point here is that values and values education, values particularly, it's a slippery kind of term that, as we've seen, and some of your lovely contributions in the chat box have already shown, that values are a complex mixture of attitudes, beliefs, ideals, mindsets, behaviours, skills, and cultural norms which come into the mix as well. And there are fine distinctions to all these, and it's actually difficult for us to unpack. But all of these are important at the level of cognitive, affective, and behavioural levels. So they're overlapping and independent. And I think of values a little bit like, you know, terms like creativity and intelligence. We all have a strong feeling of what they mean, but actually it's quite difficult to unpack. The next point, that values need a context. We need to deal with and talk about values in a particular context and with a particular frame of reference. That values usually refers to desirable behaviour, but it's often difficult to define what is desirable behaviour, and it depends very much on the place and the time and the context. We can all think, for example, that honesty is a value that most of us would subscribe to, but we can all envisage situations where it's okay to tell a white lie or something. I'm just seeing here that the sound is not clear. Can you hear me, or do I need to do anything? Am I okay? Can you hear me? The sound very clear? Yes, loud and clear. Okay, fantastic, great. I just thought I ought to check that. So the importance of a context. The next point, to do with awareness versus behaviour. It's one thing to make our children aware of issues like fairness and justice, but it's quite another to ensure that they transmit that to behaviour in the playground. So there's a gap between desiring to do the good, knowing what the good is, and actually doing it. Related to that, values are difficult to assess. If values are, as I mentioned earlier, a disposition to act in a certain way, we can't rely on specific behavioural outcomes in formal test situations to know if values education has succeeded. It would need to be over the long term and in a variety of formal and informal situations. Key issue next, what values? Whose values? How do we choose our values? What do these values actually mean? And think about the cultural differences between different values. Can we define core values that everyone can accept? And related to that, the issue of choice and imposition. There are actually ethical issues to do with children's rights of choice in the ethical values that they espouse. It would be an invasion of personal liberty for us as teachers to ensure that children only get good marks if they embrace certain teacher-preferred values. That values education isn't or shouldn't be about values imposition. The ownership and development of values lies with learners. And so that, if you like, is pointing more to a pedagogy of influence rather than imposition. The other thing, talking about children, well, talking about anyone actually, there is no quick fix. That values education is a continuous process. It's not direct or simple. It's something that is learnt over time. That values aren't static. They're dynamic, relating to context, as we've already seen, and also there's a continuous change taking place in the children that we work with. And so the values may not become visible until there's an opportunity or motivation for them to express it. Often, of course, values education has been espoused in various national curriculums, but I think there is an issue to do with simplistic or tokenistic interpretation in materials, in way they're dealt with in the classroom. This, to my mind, is a little bit like the way that Claire Cranch talks about how intercultural competence is dealt with in children's materials. And very often, you know, it's the 4 Fs, which stands for fairs, festivals, food, and facts. And how actually talking about those doesn't necessarily lead to developing intercultural competence skills at all. And I think it's the same very often with values. So this tokenistic or slightly, you know, it's just sort of an add-on that doesn't actually mean very much. And I think the last point here, and perhaps, you know, one of the most important, is that actually, whether we like it or not, it is impossible for us to be values neutral or values free. That teachers function as role models, and we have little chance of hiding our values. We reveal our values in everything we do, in the clothes that we wear, what we say, how we interact with others, our perceptions and our responses to different situations. And it's important to be self-aware of those values, important to be self-aware of those values, of the values that you want to transmit and can transmit. I'm just getting worried about people saying they can't hear me. Can most of you hear me? I don't want this to be an issue. As
Carol, there are 187 people in the room. There's always going to be somebody having a problem.
Okay, fantastic. I shall just carry on. I was just worried if there might be a general problem. So we as teachers then, we need to be aware of the values that we want to transmit. And we need to remember, above all, that there's only ever one person in the classroom whose behaviour you can change, and that is you. So first of all, we need to think about our own approach to race, to disability, to gender, to children from different cultures. We need to think about avoiding stereotypes in situations and examples that we give. We need to think about our own conscious or unconscious, if we can unpack that, biases towards different cultural backgrounds, and actually how very often, without meaning to, these influence our expectations of children and what they can achieve, depending on those kind of biases that we bring with us. And above all, we need to work with our class as a community to be inclusive, use inclusive language, and do everything we can to create a supportive, fair, respectful environment where everyone feels valued. And of course, as we do this, in the way that children develop values, there is a triangle of influences between the home, the family, parents and carers on the one hand, between the community, whether face-to-face, online, local community, more global community as children get older, and the role of school. And there's a very nice quote in the Jane Arnold's book on affect about self-esteem. And the quote is, "Parents hold the key to children's self-esteem, but teachers have a spare one." Now, I think it's very much the same case with values, that actually home underpins children's values, but we must never forget that we as teachers have a spare key that works brilliantly as well. So let's actually go on to have a look at how children learn values. And I'm thinking here, first of all, of 4 kind of generic ways. You may like to put your ideas in the chat box there as well. Okay, so first of all, children learn values, and I'm thinking here outside the classroom, I'm thinking in general life terms with this, but it's also in the classroom as well, through socialization. Socialization to do with children's adaptation, learning about the kind of norms of behavior that society expects of them. And as they grow up, having their habits approved or not by adults. I mean, just to give you a little example, the typical example of a child who says, I want an ice cream, okay, and the parent says, what do you say, darling? And first of all, the child just repeats, ice cream, I want an ice cream. What do you say? Over time, they learn that actually please is the word being looked at. So socialization through habits being approved, and this of course is happening very much in early years and pre-primary, well, and primary as well, when children come to school, and this socialization process of also explaining why to do things. For example, you know, with preschool children, when they all want to move forward and block other views when you're reading a story, you actually say, no, stay back, and the others can't see. So you're actually giving a reason for why it's important. So socialization then is key in how children learn values. Similarly, modeling. Modeling as parents, carers, and above all as teachers, we need to walk the talk, live the dream, provide the role model of values that we want our children to adopt. Basically the kind of, you know, Gandhi approach, be the change you want to see in the world. So you need to live out those values as well. Looking actually at more, those, if you like, are quite implicit ways of children learning values, moving on to more explicit ways, actually thinking and acting. So a process of inducing in children critical and reflective thinking, rational choice, and responsible behaviour, to give children the opportunities to think through, to reason from themselves, to question and reflect, to care, feel concerned, and act accordingly, because they need to think it through from themselves. It's no good, they don't have ownership if it's just imposed by adults. And the last thing I would say here, which is really, really important, is actually developing, giving children a language of values. In other words, giving them the kind of ethical vocabulary to enable them to actually talk about these values. A lot of the words that you've put in here, for example, empathy, respect, tolerance, that actually having ownership of that language and being able to talk about it is really important in terms of children internalizing values and that disposition to act in a certain way becoming a reality. Okay, so moving on, I would just like us to have a look at now, and it has to be a sample, but a flavour of values activities, of actually practical things that we can do in our classes to develop values education with our children. And I'd like to start off by talking briefly about the power of picture books and storytelling in values education in the language classroom with children. And I say storytelling because I'm thinking also about oral stories, I'm thinking about readers, I'm thinking about course books, I'm thinking about traditional stories from Aesop's fables or Anansi the spider, for example. And here, what I've chosen to show you here is a range of picture books that I picked off my shelf while preparing this session that are, some of you may know some of these stories, do say if you do in the chat box, that are wonderful for developing different values education aspects. For example, something else to do with differences and exclusion, Giraffes Can't Dance, Empathy and Bullying, Susan Laughs, a wonderfully moving and touching story about disability. It's a Book, The Value of Reading, okay, and Tango Makes Three, a wonderful story about family differences and the strength of love. Princess Smarty Pants there on gender equality, and 4 Feet, 2 Sandals, a wonderful story about friendship and sharing in the context of refugees and migrants. And I think it's important to say that this kind of fictional approach to values education, we are able to deal with issues that are important to children, but we're able to deal with them in a safe, non-threatening way, because we're talking about fictional characters and not yourself. But I would add here a very important health warning. Two important health warnings. And the first one is to keep a light touch. And this comes from not the words, but actually the idea from the classic book by Bruno Bettelheim. And he's talking about the psychoanalysis of traditional tales, but he talks how important it is for adults not to, and this is the term he used, rob the child of the opportunity to discover something for themselves. That actually, if we are too quick as teachers and adults to explain the value to children, to ram it down their throats, if you like, what we're likely to achieve is resistance or it going over the top of their heads. So actually we need a light touch. We need to give children the opportunity to discover these values for themselves. My other health warning comes from my own experience of teaching, and this is to do with age appropriacy of making values explicit to children. And this is a story, where I was teaching 5-year-olds, and I expect a lot of you may know that story. There was a princess long ago, lived in the tower, prince comes and rescues. And myself, as a passionate believer in gender equality, decided to get the children to act out the story the other way around, with the princess rescuing the prince. Well, I had a sea of little 5-year-old eyes looking at me as if I was completely mad, because 5-year-olds, they see the world pretty much in black and white, and they know that it's princes who rescue princesses and not the other way around. So actually the only value I managed to convey was that English teachers don't know their fairy stories. However, if I'd done the same thing with 8-year-olds, they would have got it. So there's an age appropriacy issue there as well. Moving on, and actually deriving from very often story and storytelling, is the whole area of drama and role play, which actually gives an opportunity for children not only to develop their language skills, of course, but to explore values in a lifelike kind of context. So the examples up here, for example, you have a role play from something else where the two strange creatures in the story are making friends with another creature who turns up. We have from the giraffe story where poor Gerald suffers such humiliation because he can't dance at the jungle story, is being given advice by the cricket. And so this is actually, in a fictional context, getting children to think through how they would empathise and help someone who can't do a particular thing. And these other examples are based on contexts and situations which are very interesting to do with children, particularly at upper primary. For example, you find a £50 note in the street. What do you do with it? Or a friend of yours has cheated at homework. What do you do? Or somebody who's nicked a chocolate bar from a shop, and actually role play that you may do, you may set up with little roll cards, all the stuff we do as language teachers, but that give children this opportunity to explore values in a way that is meaningful and relevant to them. And moving on here, and thinking of addressing values explicitly, actually what we do in our classes to explicitly talk about values and get children to think about values in relation to their own lives and behaviour. And I think the important point here, these are just a few examples on the screen, is that they never come from nothing. So, for example, looking at the example down the bottom there, why is it important not to be greedy? The children might have read the story about King Midas, for example, or the good luck story. They might have read a historical story about the California gold rush. So actually what they're doing is looking at something generally and then talking about it in relation to themselves. But this kind of explicit discussion with a light touch and never cold, always derived from something. Moving on, another area that I find actually wonderful for values education with children is drawing on the whole area of philosophy for children, sometimes called P4C. And philosophy for children was developed in the 1970s by Matthew Lipman. And it was actually trying to actually realize that, you know, children are capable of reasoning and argumentative skills long before they're expected to do that in school. And so philosophy for children, a way of actually helping children develop their critical thinking skills, and picked up on very much by authors that many of you will know, I'm sure, Robert Fisher. He has some wonderful books on thinking stories and games for thinking that are all to do with this kind of philosophical approach. So here's an example here based on the reference that you've got below. And this is a little story, okay, about a selfish hippo. And actually what the task is for the children is, what does it mean to be selfish? And they have to be ready to say 3 things. Well, I'm not going to tell you the story as I would do a class, but the story is about, you know, Harry the hippo. He won't let the others into his pond, and then he won't help a monkey who's stuck under a tree because he's worried about getting hurt himself. And finally, he joins them all eating and is very greedy and eats everything without thinking it through. And so actually then what the children come up with, these 3 things that characterize someone who's selfish. And then, and this is the really interesting part, we actually talk with the children, you know, is it wrong to be selfish? Yes or no? And at first it's quite interesting because children always say, well, of course it's wrong to be selfish. We mustn't be selfish. We must be nice. But then they start thinking it through and they say, actually, if we're nice to people so that they're then nice to us, is that selfish? Okay. And they also come up with situations. They start to think of things like, well, actually, if someone asks you to share your homework, is it selfish to say no? And so they're actually beginning to unpack and explore the value of selfish. And then we move on and say, well, actually, if you're not selfish, what are you? So we've got good work on adjectives there. You're helpful, you're generous, you're kind, and so on. So philosophy for children is a very good source of values education for children. Moving on very quickly, and just to mention the whole area of values clarification activities. And these may be very, you know, ranking activities, ordering activities, discriminating activities. The little example I've put up here is one that I think it links to vocabulary development. It's using an ABC. So for example, what we could do in this case, if we were working on food, is ask the children in pairs and groups to think of a food beginning with all those letters. You might wax them into the chat box while you're thinking about it. And when they've got their alphabet, if they can't think of a food for one letter, they just miss it out. It doesn't matter. And they then go back through the foods, and possibly if we're looking at, you know, the value of healthy food and not so healthy food, they circle the food words in different colours in order to show whether they are good for you, not good for you, we should eat, we shouldn't eat, and so on. And actually doing this more creatively and more meaningfully for the children, it's often much better to let them come up with their own category, how they want to classify the activities. We could do this with activities, for activities that give you exercise, that don't give you exercise, and so on. And moving outwards from children, because in a way I think of values education, we start off very much developing values in the here and now, the things that we need to work as a community together in the classroom. And as children get older and more mature, we start to think about values in a global sense and to do with global issues. And this is the point where I would like to mention to you Global's values education based on children's understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, these goals are actually very complex in many ways, but it is also possible for us to simplify out the issues for children. And I would recommend to those of you who are interested in following it up, the references on the bottom of the slide there, the completely free downloadable British Council publication on the Sustainable Development Goals, which gives you lots and lots of ideas for working with children and young learners, and also adults, if any of you are also teaching adults, on this whole area. And the other place I would suggest you look is if you put into your browser, don't do it now, but after, World's Largest Lesson, you come up with a fantastic range of resources for developing global values education with children. Lots of different activities that we can do. One that I have done with children is, you know, these logos are very beautiful, they're very colourful, but they are also quite adult and quite abstract. And so actually one of the things that I've done with children is before them seeing these is actually to get them to come up with their own logos for these Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just show you a couple of examples there now. And of course, that's a very creative activity for children, but actually in terms of visually thinking through a logo that best expresses one of the goals, we are developing their thinking skills and also promoting that kind of disposition to adopt a specific value. And I think one other area that I also just will mention, because it is so ubiquitous, I think, in children's materials, but I think also it's one of those areas where there is the danger of tokenism, okay? And I think a lot of us, and I know there are some of you here also, writers of materials, you know, we can have recycling wraps, we can have save the animal wraps, but there is often that gap between the awareness of that being a good thing to do and actually doing it. And so the example here on the screen, and I see somehow the pictures got over the top of the text, but it really doesn't matter. This is an adaptation of a traditional song, and the reason I've chosen it for you is because actually the singing of the song incorporates the value. Because what we do when we sing this song, you probably know the tune. My voice, I'm very hoarse at the moment, but when we work together, together, together. You probably know that. So what we do is get the children in pairs to actually work out a clapping, dance and rhythm. So they are singing the song, but they are working cooperatively. And I think if there's one thing in the literature and in the research that shows that has a positive link on values education, it is providing opportunities for children to work cooperatively whenever they can. Okay, so everything that we've been looking at this morning is leading to a pedagogy of values. And what might we have in a pedagogy of values? In addition to all those things I said at the beginning about self-awareness and thinking about ourselves as teachers. And I think these things, and I've highlighted what I think are the important words in red. Okay, I'm not going to read all these out because you can perfectly well read them, and I hope they fit in with what we've been talking about up to now. Okay, implying, expanding, and giving opportunities to act. And if you like, there is a process there of awareness, of understanding, of reflection, of action. and putting them into practice, maybe within the classroom, or it may be within the real world. For example, when you have a project that involves acting in the local community. So actually what we've done in this session, and I hope I haven't run over time too much, we've looked at the link between education and values. We've looked at the threat from germ. We've had a look at what values and values education mean. We've had a look at different dimensions and spheres of values. We opened up the Pandora's box, okay, with looking at some of the complex and controversial aspects. We had a look at the triangle of influences on children's development of values. We looked at how children learn values, and we've seen a sample toolkit of practical activities. Of course, there are many others as well, leading to what I would propose as a pedagogy of values education. And my last message to you now is this, that the purposeful integration of values education enriches language learning and has a positive impact on children's well-being, work and behaviour. And if we're lucky, it might just also help to change the world. Thank you very much.
Carol, we're really glad
Yes.
that you actually had a longer talk, because Bruno hasn't appeared. Now, we do have lots of questions, so would you mind taking some of the questions? Since we have
I'm sorry I ran over. Okay.
No,
yeah, of course I'll take.
We need you.
I'll
We
take
need you to
questions.
run over. We need you to run over for ages because we're missing your second speaker. So
Okay.
we're putting loads of questions on the screen for you, and Leah will help you with them. Okay.
Okay. So shall I just do them? Shall I just answer the questions in order? Can everyone see those questions as well, or shall I read them out?
They should be able to see them. They're on the screen, and Leah is there to help you if you need it. Okay.
Okay. Have you any day without any feedback? Well, I mean, feedback I think is a hugely important part of education and language teaching in general, and not just values education. That feedback needs to be an integral part of what we do, of the process in the classroom, not just coming at the ends of units of work or topics or whatever. And so I think feedback on values education is the same, but I think, again, I feel really strongly that we have to keep this light touch. I actually think that when adults kind of blunder in there with values, you must do this, you must actually, and with older primary children particularly, the barriers start to go up. So I think the kind of feedback, yes, of course, to ensure that children have understood about the values, but without, as I said before, ramming it down their throat. Moving on, how do you motivate your kids? Well, that's a very big question. Well, how do you motivate your kids? Some different questions. Okay. Well, motivation, I think you motivate your children by ensuring that you're choosing topics and that are meaningful and relevant for them, that have something in it for them, the what's in it for them kind of factor, and also about your whole approach. I actually believe with young children, we communicate our passion for teaching and learning very, very unexplicitly. We don't actually need to do very much, but we need to ensure that children feel they feel valued, they feel respected, they feel that we're interested in their learning, that we care about their learning, and that above all that we have high expectations of them. I mean, very often when I'm working with teachers, I actually suggest that if you treat your children like little grown-ups, they actually will respond to that and respond to your expectations, and that is also very motivating. Okay, the next question.
Carol,
Now
there's a question
Hello?
on how to train. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm just going through these questions. Okay, you want to ask me one?
Well, no, I was just thinking that on the topic of training teachers, there's a question about, do teachers need training to teach in this way, and how can we do that to help them? I felt like it was on the same topic, so I wanted to bring that question to the forefront.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. I haven't seen that. I've seen loads of questions here. Really lovely, lovely question. On teacher education, I think it's absolutely fundamental to incorporate values education as part of teacher education courses, and I think it is like it's a theme that is going to come up whatever we're talking about in teacher education. It's something that cannot be ignored. And I think what I highlighted at the beginning, the global trend towards big data and and sort of itemized teaching and a narrowing of the curriculum, that actually it's really important in our teacher education programs with children to balance that up by looking at holistic learning, and values education is of course a part of that, as is the whole area of intercultural competence that we didn't address in this session as well, but it's part of values education. It's an absolutely fundamental part of it, I would say. Definitely. So do you want me to carry on going through these questions?
Yes, please. I mean,
Yes,
if
please.
you would like to choose the questions that you like, or if you would like some help,
I think if I choose, I'll be too long. I better just go. There's a lovely question here, which I think there are people out there who would be able to answer this better than I can. What's the biggest challenge of teaching refugees as they come from different ethnic backgrounds, and how to overcome it? Well, I have to say straight away that I do not have personal experience of teaching refugees. But I remember last year I went to a fascinating panel at the IATEFL conference on teaching refugees. And one of the messages that I took home from that, and I don't know if there's anyone in the chat box who was at that session as well, was how actually not to treat children differently, not to give them this label, refugees, that actually they're children. And so we need to be inclusive and work with them as a community, and not it's this kind of the victimization thing. They don't want to be treated as they are children. But I think, having said that, there are also going to be huge challenges in terms of psychological approach, and things that very often we as language teachers are not particularly trained in kind of actually responding to and dealing with trauma that that they have experienced. And of course we need to be super sensitive in relation to that, and that I'm not able to answer in that way, because that's not my area of expertise. But I would have thought that actually our approach to values education, if we believe passionately in values in any classroom, I mean, if I think of classrooms that I've worked in Spain, where there are migrant children from all over the place, children who are having extraordinary kind of traumatic time in their arrival. And actually what we do is start at the center. So, we work with the children in a way to help them feel safe in the community of the classroom, safe, valued, respected, wanted, all of that within the classroom context. That's crucial. Where should I go to now? How can an educator or an institution get the parents involved? That's a lovely question, and that's opening up another Pandora's box in a way, because parents may have a whole range of different values. I think as far as possible, it's wonderful if we can get parents involved at an institutional level. I mean, some of the work done by Neil Hawkes on a whole school values education policy involves parents, and the school, focuses on a particular value every month, and parents are written to, they have the value explained, they are suggested ways to support the child in that value, and I think it is really important, the home-school link, to actually have parents on board with anything that we're doing with our children, from how our approach to language teaching is to values education as well. I'm not sure if that answers it. Please, some lovely ideas here, of course. Yeah, creating an inclusive and positive environment, absolutely. Would you agree that if we want our students to learn this values, don't the teacher need to practice the values as well? Absolutely. Modeling these values. I think it is crucial. I mean, it's like anything that we want to our children to do. If we want them to be polite, if we want them to be kind, if we want them to be respectful, this is all two-way traffic, and we need to model these values as well. I don't know if that answers it. The next thing here, what's the difference between others and the world around? Well, I think those are the spheres of values, and I mentioned that there is overlap between them. But I think what I was thinking about here was the way values education impinges on other individuals who are around us. So things like kindness, sharing, generosity, helping, and the world around us more to do, if you like, with those with issues to do with the environment, with the sustainable development goals that we had a look at in the talk, if you like, to do with things that are distinctly outside in the bigger world, if you like. How to integrate values in lessons? Well, I hope I showed you some ideas, and I think, if you like, it takes place in many ways, because values we're always integrating values in our lessons. It's taking place in a subliminal way, because actually the very way we greet our children, we start off, the questions we ask them, the listening time we give them, the value we put on their communication rather than just their language accuracy, all of this is integrating values in our lessons. And some of the explicit ways, well, the generic things, that some of the things I told you, through picking up on values that are conveyed in stories, through role play, through discussion, through different kinds of creative activities that we can do. But I think what I would also suggest is that actually, there is, when we're writing our lesson plans, if we write a lesson plan, that there is actually a values aim, a values kind of objective. Of course, it's not going to be something that is measurable in a test, but very often, whatever we're teaching, whatever little text, there's always values attached there. Now here's a very difficult one. It's one I've thought about myself a lot, and I think it is really quite hard to answer, but thank you for asking this question. What if our notion of values clashes with parents' own values and prejudices? And I think, this is a real issue, because we touched on the cultural differences between values, and I can think, for example, of colleagues or friends I have who are working in contexts where perhaps, cultural values are very different with our own kinds of values. And I think one of the ways that I like to cope with this is to actually ring fence my classroom. That in my classroom, I want these values to be what we all adhere to. So actually, if you're a child and you come to my class and you are a member of our community, these are the values in our classroom. So, for example, I don't know, to do with gender equality, for example, and I think by ring fencing it in that way, there is not a need to have any kind of conflict. And of course, when we are working in other cultures and other contexts, we need to be extremely sensitive and respectful of other cultures as well. But at the same time, we have to keep our own integrity. And I think that's an approach, that's a way forward. Anyone else got any answers to that question? Because do put them in the chat box if you have. Moving on, this green question here. Do we need to hold a meeting to increase awareness of the ways some teachers? Okay, that's a very good question as well, Asma. This kind of balance between the syllabus and covering the curriculum and language education. And in a way that picks up on the big data thing that I was talking about, the kind of obsession, if you like, of getting through children through a curriculum, covering the syllabus and so on. I think one of my ways of tackling that, and I hope that it came across in the talk, but perhaps I didn't focus it on specifically enough, is that actually everything we do in the language classroom to develop values education is fundamentally building on children's language skills. If you look, for example, that philosophy for children example I gave you, children are actually learning new vocabulary, things like selfish and the opposite of selfish. And so actually one way of countering that is to say we're not just delivering the syllabus and covering the curriculum, we are actually doing a lot more. We are enhancing and enriching children's language education and developing those crucial kind of creative and critical thinking skills as well. Do we think of a design model or kind of practice to increase the awareness of values embedded? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I absolutely think we do need a model of values education that works for our context. I mean, those of you here who work for private institutions or schools, I would strongly recommend that you follow up by looking at the work of Neil Hawkes and also think about adopting a values education policy for the whole school and a kind of model of values. I mean, for me, it's a little bit about like the model of intercultural competence that I've developed, that values education with our very small, very young children starts with the here and now of being in the classroom. That our values education with 3-year-olds is to do with, it's to do with being willing to share the colours, being willing to sit in your place in the circle so you don't block other people's views. It's these very concrete kind of values. And as children get older, we are able, and as they become more cognitively mature, in Piaget's terms, if you like, then we are able to talk about these values, to actually explore the reasons for these values and how they impact on the real world. Innocent children may lose some of their values when they experience the real world. Good question. And encounter situations on the internet and in the social media. How to empower them for everlasting world? Oh, well, that's a wonderful question. I wish I could answer it. I think, it's kind of being persistent and perseverance and patience, and also equipping them with the critical thinking skills to actually recognize, you know, what is happening on social media and the internet. I was last week, actually, I was in the UK and I was doing, I don't know if any of them are here, but I was doing a day of training with Danish educators, and I learned about this wonderful wonderful work that they do with adolescents to actually make adolescents aware of social media, the dangers and risks in social media, but not only that, how to project their identities on social media, what kind of identities they want to project for which kind of message. And I think all of that is actually crucial in empowering or preparing our children for the world ahead. And here, lastly, from Trixie, do you think it's necessary for the schools to open develop? Yeah, I do. I really do. And I think it is something, it's something that I've seen it happen in various ways, actually, because I do a lot of schools visiting. I go to a lot of schools in many different countries. And in some countries, I've seen a values education program where they have a values a month, but actually that what really is involved with that is seeing with whether, or testing in a way, whether the children conform to those values. So I think it needs to go much deeper than that, and it needs to be something that a whole school staff buys into, if you like, and that is enacted in every area of the curriculum. At the same time, I think if we're just teachers in our own regular language classes and we don't have access to that, what we can do is to enact the values that we believe in our classroom. Okay, so what's Connie put here? It's about thinking and reshaping the curriculum. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, no, I agree with all of that. Okay, so solutions, I said in my title, and solutions I was thinking of in terms of how we approach values pedagogy and activities and procedures that we can use in our classroom to empower children to think about values and to and for positive values to influence their behavior. I mean, I obviously don't have answers to how to ensure that this will last for life, but actually, you know, that dictum, give me a child until he is 7, you know, I think if we instill those values from a very early age, we genuinely do have power to bring about change. Children are the future, so that's where we've got to start. So thanks very much. Unless there are some more questions.
Carol, you've done a sterling job. Brilliant.
Okay.
we think we found Brunel.
Thank you so much,
audience
Carol. I think that it was both inspirational and practical, and I think that we all learned a lot of new ideas to bring to the classroom. We're just waiting a few minutes on our second speaker, Bruno, to log in. He's had some internet problems in Brazil, and he should be with us any
wow.
minute.
Okay. Are there more questions?
I understand he's just about to log in, so maybe this is
we'll
good
just
time
take a pause for a second while we try and get him. Brilliant. I've just paused the microphone. So so as Leah was to say, we've had a few issues, or Bruno's had a few issues. So basically, just to give you the background here, Carol said, can she talk for more than half an hour, which is what we allowed people to do. And I said, oh yeah, so as long as you don't push it. And thankfully, an hour and 15 minutes later, she's managed to fill a huge hole in the program. So I think she deserves a massive round of applause from everybody.
Well, actually, massively interesting questions from everybody there. So thank you for all those really interesting questions. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought.
It was, yeah. I think that's because the topic itself was so interesting, and you presented it so insightfully that it was causing lots of discussion, which was great. You just, we were sat there panicking behind the scenes going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And quite luckily you have done it. And there, just as we said, there is Bruno. So we are going to give, obviously, Bruno the chance to do his talk. Let's just quickly see if his sound is there. So, Carol, for the time being, could I just ask you to go quiet while we get Bruno on?
Absolutely, I go quiet. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sean. Okay, bye then.
Brilliant,
Yeah.
Bruno. Hi, welcome. We hear you've had a few issues. Can we get you on microphone so we can? If we can.
Can you hear me?
Oh, hello. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. There was a power blackout here in Rio. Power just got restored.
Oh, you must be panicking like crazy. Great. Do you have a camera for me?
I am. I do. Just a second. Let me just get this right here.
So, Bruno, hopefully, once we get going, of course, there won't be much time for questions because we're slightly late in the schedule now.
Okay. No problem. Let me
obviously, we'll get the speaker. Is your camera working?
Is it not?
It's coming on now. There you go.
Okay. Oh, better.
Perfect. Hello.
Hi. Good.
Great. Leah, do you want to introduce it? Well,
sorry?
I was asking Leah if she wants to introduce you.
Okay.
You've got about 30 minutes. Do you reckon you can do it in that time?
Yeah. Sure.
I won't take too much time to introduce you. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Bruno Andrade from Brazil, ELT, and a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's also a primary and secondary English language teacher at a private school in Rio. He holds an MA in Applied Linguistics from UFRJ and has experience in YL teacher training, course development, materials design, events organizing, and educational consultancy. So over to you, Bruno. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Leah. First of all, I'd like to apologize